Okay, so this is going to be the third and final segment of our lecture for October 31st. And the last place that we left off was we had gotten to the bottom of this particular slide here. So I want to talk about how this issue, France and Britain at war, is going to affect the United States. When we return to class on the 7th, I have a diagram I'm going to draw you on the board about the problems with American neutrality. But for now, let's just go through what's on the slide here, and then I think that diagram will help you visualize this issue. So European powers fight wars with one another often. France, Britain, Spain, they're going to fight with each other quite often. And the United States is going to be in a position where it wants to remain neutral, particularly in this war we're talking about here, this war between Britain and France. You don't have to write anything under this. I'm just going to talk about it for a minute. The United States is trying to remain neutral, but the United States wants to trade with both nations. And the problem is that if France wants to hurt Britain, one of the things it can do is disrupt its trade. But disrupting American-French trade is not going to just hurt the other nation, it's also going to hurt the United States, if that makes sense. So the US, for example, is trading with Britain. France wants to hurt Britain, so it's going to intercept trade between America and Britain. And yes, that will hurt Britain, but it will also hurt the United States. Again, I'll draw a diagram that I think makes this a little, I don't even know if diagram is the word, a drawing that I think makes this a little more clear. You can visualize it better. But so the United States wants to remain neutral, but it also wants to trade with both countries, both France and Britain. Now, there's going to be a problem with Britain doing something called impressing Americans. So I'll explain and then I'll give you a short definition. Basically, what that means is it's sort of like kidnapping, I suppose, if you want a single word to think about to give you a definition. But basically what they would do is they would stop American ships and board them and say, you guys are all not Americans, you're actually just deserters of the British military, and so you now must return to the British military. They're basically forcing them into British naval service. So British impressing Americans, impressment is the British Navy, this is what I would write. So the British Navy seizing American ships and forcing Americans into British naval service. So forcing Americans into British naval service. That's impressment. So what's going to happen is John Jay, who at the time is Chief Justice, is going to be sent to London to try and negotiate this issue among with some others with Britain. So just to give you a background, you don't need to write this, but other issues that that Jay is going to be discussing in England is he's particularly going to be concerned with the fact that once the American Revolutionary War was over and the treaty was signed, the British had promised to remove their troops from military outposts in America. And they still had not done this. And this was a decade later, over a decade later. This is 1794 that this treaty is signed. So they're particularly concerned with that as well as with the impressment. Now, the British, on the other hand, are going to be frustrated with some things that the Americans are doing, particularly, and you don't need to write this down, but particularly, remember I told you that a lot of American colonists were in debt to British merchants back in England, particularly London. They owed a lot of money for goods that they had purchased while they were living. Even though they're colonists here in the Americas, they were still purchasing things from London, and they were supposed to pay those debts back, but after the revolution, they were trying to avoid paying them. And so the Americans are not repaying their debts, and the British are not recalling their soldiers, and they're also impressing Americans into naval service. So when John Jay goes to Britain, what ends up happening is that the British, in number 2, where I say British, what do they concede? You can write very little. Okay, so they really concede very little. Now, one of the things they do say they will do is finally remove these troops that, you don't have to write this, but that they're going to remove the troops that they still had here in the Americas. But, people found this, when Americans back home found out about this treaty, they really didn't like it at first. And one of the things they found frustrating was, why did you consider that a concession when that was something that was supposed to have happened as a result of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolution over a decade ago? So what the main issue in this treaty is going to be this number 3 here. The U.S. will favor Britain in trade. So what I would write after that is, so the U.S. is favoring Britain over France. Okay, so the U.S. will favor Britain over trade. Okay, so the U.S. is going to favor Britain, which means that the U.S. is favoring Britain over France. So it seems to many Americans, as well as the French, that the United States is sort of turning its back on France and aligning itself with Britain. The American response over this issue is divided. I think your book actually tells you that there are so many people who are unhappy about this when word reaches the United States that John Jay joked that he could find his way home by the light of the effigies, people burning him an effigy. Remember, that's when you would take a doll that looked like a person and then burn it to show your anger or your disapproval of that person. What's kind of interesting, and we won't really talk about this again just because it's not something that we'll come back to, but so many Americans are against this treaty early on, but then once it's ratified and goes into effect, the favoring of Britain in trade is actually beneficial to the United States in regards to our economy. So people in the long run, actually a lot of people tend to view it as a positive thing, even though it had such a negative, a bad reputation early on. Okay. Something else that's going to happen under the Washington administration is the Whiskey Rebellion, and I'll give you a minute to write this. If you're still writing, that's okay. I'm just going to talk about this a little bit. You don't have to write anything else here. Basically what happens is the first domestic tax, so the first tax that the federal government is going to place on a good in the United States, is going to be a tax on, it's actually a tax on all distilled spirits, so on liquor in general. But it becomes known as a whiskey tax because whiskey was really the preferred liquor of the time period. Okay, so it's a tax on liquor, but it becomes known as the whiskey tax. And the purpose of this is to raise money for the federal government. Essentially, the federal government of the United States is in debt as a result of the Revolutionary War. whiskey in many rural parts of America. And something I'll probably say a few times in the duration of this semester, and it's not a fact you need to memorize, but just to sort of put this in perspective, up until 1920, you have more Americans living in rural areas than urban and suburban areas. So rural America is the majority. The majority of people live in rural areas up until 1920. So, keep in mind that this, at this time especially, this is a country of mostly farmers. And so these farmers in America often use whiskey as a medium of exchange. And basically that means as money. They use it to barter with trade. I'll explain what this means. You don't need to write anything extra here unless you're interested in the Whiskey Rebellion. I wouldn't ask you, specifics about the Whiskey Rebellion on a test. I would probably just ask you in general which of the following is true of the Whiskey Rebellion, and you'll want to know that it's a tax on liquor and that well, let's get through this slide, and then I'll tell you what you want to know, what to highlight. Okay, so essentially this evasion piece right here, what it means is that if you are found to be evading the tax, you are a backcountry farmer and you're not paying the tax and you live somewhere in Pennsylvania, then you must travel to, like Philadelphia, for example, to sit trial for your violation of this law, which means that not only do you have to owe money to pay the tax, and then you're probably going to have some punishment. You're also going to have to leave your farm and travel all the way to an urban area to sit your trial, which means that you're going to be taken away from your farm, taken away from your work, and as a result, you'll lose money that way. Okay, so in general, many people do not agree with this tax, especially farmers who see it as equally abhorrent as the taxes that they had protested against Parliament for in the previous years. They don't like having to pay a tax on something that they even use as a medium of exchange, as money, and they especially dislike the idea that if they're found in violation, they have to travel to sit their trial. So what happens in the rebellion? Well, basically, there's a bunch of farmers in the backcountry in Pennsylvania who are going to protest. They're going to refuse to pay the tax. They're going to go attack the house of the tax collector. And again, this all sounds very familiar. And if you remember, these protests had been pretty widely accepted among many colonists in the years leading up to the American Revolution. But when we got to a somewhat similar protest in Shays' Rebellion, many people found this protest no longer acceptable because there's now an acceptable way to show your discontent, and that is to vote your representatives out of office, right? And that had not been an option under a monarchy, even a constitutional monarchy, which is what the colonists were under when they were colonists of Great Britain. The idea was, now we're the United States and you can no longer express your grievances by doing that. And so it's the same thing with the Whiskey Rebellion. And these protesters believe that they're doing the same thing. They are protesting in the same spirit of the American Revolution. But just like in Shays' Rebellion, the men who are in charge of forming the government and running the government, for the most part, are not going to approve of this. And so President Washington is going to declare that this is not acceptable, and he actually is going to lead 13,000 militiamen. That's more troops than he had under his command in the Revolutionary Army. 13,000 militiamen. He's going to lead them partway to go and put down this rebellion in Pennsylvania. And actually, by the time that the troops arrive, the rebels have dispersed. So it ends up being something of a non-issue. In general, the whiskey tax is difficult to collect, but the tax will remain on the books until the Jefferson administration. Jefferson will actually repeal this tax. So what should you know about this slide? What should you highlight? I would highlight that it's a tax on liquor. You can put whiskey in parentheses if you want, if that will help you remember why it's called the Whiskey Rebellion. And that there are rebels in Pennsylvania that are put down by the knowledge that Washington's troops are on their way. So I would just highlight under A, I would highlight 1. Under B, I would highlight 1. And under C, I would highlight 1. And I think that would be sufficient. This is a question that I tend to put on the exam unless I have too many multiple choice questions. I can't ask about everything that I intended to ask about, and in that case, I would not ask this. Okay, George Washington's farewell address is important. This is something that I ask about on exams. It is something that you want to remember, not just for the purposes of this class, but I think in general, as an American, knowing the significance of this is helpful in understanding the way that politicians and people in general view America's role in the world today. Okay, so under A, I put the question, why did he leave office? In other words, why did Washington leave office? I don't think I mentioned that he, I didn't mention that he won the first election, 1788, and then he wins re-election in 1792. So he serves 2 terms. The reason that he leaves office, all I would write there is he wanted to. That's it. He wanted to. And the reason I bring this up, and you don't need to write anything else, but we don't have a law against running more than twice or being president more than twice until after Franklin Roosevelt in the 1900s is elected 4 times and serves all of his first 3 terms, and then he's early into his 4th term when he dies. So he actually was elected 4 times, and after that we get a law saying that you can only serve 2 terms. But there's a reason why no one had served more than 2 terms up until Franklin Roosevelt, and it's because of Washington. So basically, Washington didn't necessarily want to be president, and he certainly had dreams of retiring often, going back to his home, his plantation, and really just being finished with public office. But he saw it as his duty to his country, and so as a result, he does serve both times. But at the end of the 2nd term, he says, I'm not going to seek re-election for a 3rd term. And one of the things he says is not only because he doesn't want to be president anymore, but also because he doesn't want to set this precedent that someone could be president as many terms as they want. They could be president forever. And so when he sets this precedent, the fact that he only serves 2 terms means that presidents, for the most part after him, believe that they should only serve 2 terms. People really put Washington on a pedestal, and they feel that if Washington didn't do it, then no one else after him should do it. So if no one else had served more than 2 terms, if Washington had not served any more than 2 terms, then no one else should either. So that's why people did not serve 2 terms until FDR. So when Washington leaves office, he's going to give a farewell address, talking to the nation about, saying goodbye, and talking to the nation about a couple of issues that he sees as important to addressing at the time period in the early 1797 when he leaves office. This farewell address is published. It's published in the newspapers. It's not delivered. It's not that he stands up and speaks. It's not like the Gettysburg Address where, we know that Lincoln wrote it and on the train, and it was short, and he delivered it, and he delivered it orally. He actually read his speech, right? This was more, this was written, and so it was distributed like that in the newspapers. And he's going to give 2 important warnings. And this is what I would highlight. I would highlight C. All of these things here, and I'll give you a minute to write, and then I'll talk about it. Okay, if you're still writing, it's okay. I'm just going to talk about this for a little bit, for a minute. I don't think there's too much that you'll need to add here. The one thing that I would maybe add, if it will help you, is under number 1, so avoid political factionalism. If it helps you, you could add in parentheses political parties. Okay, so let me talk about this for a minute. Washington's farewell address is going to give 2 warnings that people take pretty seriously. And the first is avoid political factionalism, in other words, political parties. He doesn't believe that political parties will be beneficial for the United States, and he's going to warn against it. And in his address, which I'm going to show you the text of it in a minute, he says that, even though there are regional differences, the differences sort of balance each other out for the good of the country as a whole. So he warns against political parties. The second thing he says is that the U.S. should not meddle in the affairs of European nations. In other words, it's sort of like what I was saying before. Europe is all the way over there, and the European nations war with each other often. And so why would we get involved if we don't have to? And so this is going to lead to an isolationist foreign policy. In other words, I'll talk about it for a minute, and then I'll give you something to write. In other words, what he's saying is the U.S. should try to remain neutral in world conflicts as much as possible, unless there's an absolute direct reason that we need to get involved. And the United States is going to try to abide by this up until really World War II. And you could even say, like, there are times when maybe the U.S. didn't follow this as well as it should have, or times when perhaps it should have or could have intervened in a war earlier than it did. For example, World War I, there were certainly reasons for the United States to get involved earlier than it did. But this is something that you do still hear politicians argue about today. What should our foreign policy be in regards to warfare or conflicts that are happening in parts of the world that don't necessarily have to do directly with us? Today it's different, right? Because we are militarily very mighty, and economically we are very involved with so much of the world. So it's a different context today than it would have been back then. But for a long time we do maintain or try to maintain this isolationist foreign policy. So let me just give you a brief definition of isolationist foreign policy. If you need one, you might not. You might be familiar enough with this that you don't need anything written in your notes. But basically, this is in general. If you're not familiar with the term foreign policy, it refers to the way that we deal with other countries, right? So what is our policy in dealing with other nations? So isolationist foreign policy would be this. It is the United States tries to remain neutral in foreign conflicts as much as possible. So the United States tries to remain neutral in foreign conflicts as much as possible. That's really the sort of the simplistic version of it. So Washington is going to warn about these two things. One, don't have political parties; they're bad for the country. They divide you. There's more that unites us than divides us, essentially. And two, don't get involved in European issues because they're always at war. And oftentimes it's not going to be beneficial to the United States. We're still a small country. We're still getting ourselves established. There's no need for us to get involved. The last bullet that I have on this slide is that our second president is John Adams. But I do want to take a minute and show you part of the text of George Washington's farewell address. Okay, so here's the text of Washington's farewell address, and I won't read you the whole thing, obviously, but I want to just go through those parts of where those two issues are addressed here. And so, he really, first he thanks the country for, placing their trust in him and so on and so forth. And then he says, for this you have, here he says, citizens by birth or choice of a common country. That country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. In other words, think of yourself more as an American and less of, a New Yorker or a North Carolinian. With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have, in a common cause, fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts of common dangers, sufferings, and successes. But these considerations, however powerfully they address themselves to your sensibility, are greatly outweighed by those which apply more immediately to your interest. Here every portion of our country finds the most commanding motives for carefully guarding and preserving the union of the whole. In other words, even like your economic interests are better off if you take them as a whole and not just by location. So then he addresses each part of the country. The North, in an unrestrained intercourse, that means trade, with the South, protected by the equal laws of a common government, finds in the productions of the latter great additional resources of maritime and commercial enterprise and precious materials of manufacturing industry. The South, in the same intercourse, benefiting by the agency of the North, sees its agriculture grow and its commerce expand. And then he continues, talks about the East and the West. He's really trying to show Americans that they do have this commonality, which is should trump any regional differences. He then goes on to talk about the issues of foreign relations. So here he says, the great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here let us stop. So in other words, let us keep our word if we have made an agreement so far, but let us not make any more. He says Europe has a set of primary interests which to us have none, or a very remote relation. Hence, she being Europe, must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. And then he talks really about why the issue of, he says, why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice. So why would we risk our peace and stability when their issues are really issues that pertain to them and perhaps only remotely would pertain to us as well? So those are that's really what I wanted to show you from the farewell address. And remember, under C, this is really what you want to highlight is all of that there. The farewell address is something that is important to remember for our class. It's something I would ask a question on, and a multiple choice question on an exam. But it's also something that I think understanding this farewell address and how it helped shape our isolationist foreign policy for quite some time is helpful to know if you engage in political discussions or like paying attention to the political arguments that are going on today or just in general. So when we look at the Adams administration, Washington served 2 terms. He could have run for a 3rd term. He chose not to. Adams is going to run and win in the 1796 election, and we'll see he's going to be a 1-term president. Actually, John Adams and then his son, John Quincy Adams, who wins the election in 1824, are going to be our first 2 1-term presidents in the United States. So the first thing that I have here is just a general comment, and I think if any of you have watched the HBO miniseries, it was done, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now, maybe not quite that long ago, based on a book by David McCullough, who is a biographer. He wrote a quite lengthy book on Adams. He also wrote one on Truman. And I think in more recent years, people have become more interested, or at least scholars have talked more about Adams than they had in the past, because he's sort of sandwiched in between these really sort of beloved or important, I hate to use the word important as if Adams wasn't important, but just in general what they did while they were in office, presidents of Washington first and then Jefferson after Adams. John Adams as a person is typically considered to have been unlikable. People did not like him. He was short-tempered. He was said to have been very vain, very full of himself. But he also was said to have a pretty sturdy moral character, if that makes any sense. I don't know if we talked about it. I actually don't know if I mentioned that he defended the troops who had shot into the crowd at the Boston Massacre. No one else, he's a lawyer, and no one else would really take the case, and so he takes the case. And so he's sort of seen as this man who has upstanding moral character, but in general he's not very likable by his peers. Under his administration is really sort of marred by the issue of what is going on with France. So if you remember, France and Britain are at war. We've talked about that a few times already in this lecture. And France is seizing American ships. Remember, France wants to hurt Britain. France is also frustrated with the Jay Treaty. So France is seizing American ships. So we're going to get something called the XYZ affair. And I'll give you a minute to write and then I'll talk about it. Okay, if you're still writing, that's okay. Essentially what happens in the XYZ affair is that John Adams is going to send some diplomats to France. You don't have to write anything here, I'll just talk about this. To address the issue of the French seizing American ships and what to do about that permanent alliance that we had formed with France back in 1778. In other words, perhaps negotiate a new alliance, something more updated. And so the diplomats are really just, I don't know how to put it. They're given a runaround, if you're familiar with that expression. They keep waiting to see the foreign minister. The foreign minister continuously does not see them. And so then these 3 guys who will not reveal their actual names, they just identify themselves as agents X, Y, and Z. They're going to show up and meet with the American diplomats and say, well, the foreign minister will meet with you if you give us a bribe, and the bribe must be $250,000, and then you need to give us a $10 million loan. So they make these demands, and the American diplomats do not agree. They return to the United States, and there's all this public anger against France because the diplomats had been treated so poorly in France when they had gone and were never able to meet with the foreign minister there. So what ends up happening, remember we had the Genet affair, we now have the XYZ affair. So this has been, almost really a decades-long issue with France. How should the United States deal with France as it's experiencing its revolution, and then it starts fighting this war with Britain? And so what is our role here? Well, we're going to end up in what is referred to as the quasi-war with France. So this is our first engagement with another nation, military engagement with another nation, and it's not a declared war. Congress does not declare war. It's also very short. It's essentially a series of small skirmishes at sea. So I put battles at sea. This is really it's a naval fight, but it's a series of small skirmishes. And there's, as I said, there's no declaration of war. But this lasts for a very short period of time. I think the negotiation actually lasts longer than the period of aggressiveness. And there's a peace that comes in 1800. There's a negotiation settled between the French and the American government. And this peace is going to end the conflict, but it's also going to, you can just write end the conflict, but it's also going to get rid of that permanent alliance that the U.S. and France had in 1778. It will nullify that. And so, Adams, there are some historians who have said that the issue with France, in particular the quasi-war, is one of the main reasons why Adams did not win re-election. The news of this peace did not reach the American public in time for the 1800 election, in the fall of 1800, and had the news reached America in time for that election, then he may have been able to win re-election. Now, one thing that you want to highlight here is the Alien and Sedition Acts. In general, if you choose on your next test to respond to the essay question about the differences between the French and American revolutions, one of the things that I will ask about in that question is to briefly discuss American-French relations once the war has concluded. So you certainly want to talk about how the relationship was strained. You could give an example with the Genet affair or with the XYZ affair. You could talk about the quasi-war. Any of those things would be a good example to show that the relationship between the United States and France was shaky, on shaky grounds after the French Revolution had initiated and essentially reached the point of initiated its revolution and reached the point of its revolution where it had become quite violent. Okay, the other thing you want to highlight, or something you want to highlight, like everyone should remember this for a multiple choice question, are the Alien and Sedition Acts. So basically what this is that it's going to be two laws that will, let's see how you could put it, restrict the rights of Americans. Okay, you could write, that would be a good way of writing it in your notes. So there are two laws that restrict the rights of Americans. Now, let me just tell you what they did. You don't need to write this down. If you remember that they restrict the rights, that's good enough. But essentially, the Alien Act is going to say that, at this point, immigrants could become citizens once they had lived in the United States for 5 years. That's going to be changed to 14 years. This is an anti-immigrant type of law. And the second one is the Sedition Acts, and this is going to allow the president to, or allow the government to consider it a crime if a person is writing or saying things against the government that are false or scandalous or terrible type of thing. So this really is an infringement on freedom of speech. There's also the ability, I forgot to mention that the president has the power to put someone in prison or deport them if they're a foreigner and they're deemed in any way to be unsafe to the United States. But this is pretty open. This is a pretty open law, so it's up for interpretation or potential misuse. Okay, so if I told you what they did, but I told you not to write the specifics, why are they so important? Well, under concerns, you want to write violation of freedoms such as freedom of speech. Okay, so violations of freedoms such as freedom of speech. And then I would add meaning the federal government is overstepping its power. So meaning the federal government is overstepping its power. And the reason that this is important is because in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, we're going to see something called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. So let me talk about them for a minute, and then I'll tell you what you want to write in your notes and why they're important. So essentially, the legislatures of the state of Virginia and the state of Kentucky are going to get together and they are going to write resolutions or statements where they basically are going to say that they don't believe that these laws are legal and that they the federal government is really out of its bounds here. And what they're going to say, and this is the part that you want to write down, is they promote the idea that the states have the right, so they promote the idea that the states have the right to declare a federal law void, so that the states have the right to declare a federal law void if the states believe that law is unconstitutional. So if the states believe that law is unconstitutional. Now, you want to highlight that and you want to remember it, and I'm going to tell you why. When we get to the probably not until after our second exam, but when we get to the decades leading up to the Civil War, we're going to see this issue is returned to. Is it possible, is it legal for a state to declare that a federal law is unconstitutional and say that they have the right not to follow it? In this issue is going to come up more than once, particularly in regards to issues of slavery. And remember, I'll say this over and over again because I think that it's something that might be new to a lot of you. The Civil War is really fought at the outset over the politics of slavery. And so this argument about whether or not a state can nullify a federal law in regards to concerns over slavery is going to be a major part of this political debate that will lead us up to the Civil War. Okay, so you want to remember Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And I just put here, I mentioned it already, but that Adams serves no second term. Okay, this is a good place to stop. I have just a couple more slides on Chapter 7. Like I said, Chapter 7 is quite long, or at least that it covers a lot of information. Chapter 8, I don't have much to say about it, mainly the things that are covered in your quiz. And then we'll move right on to Module 4. If you have any questions about any of the information that we've covered in this lecture, please feel free to email me or just jot a note down and we can talk about it when we return to class on the 7th. And have a nice Halloween.